Hi, and welcome back to the EV Life podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Maharaj, and I'm with Hannah Neal Robertson, our producer.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be back on the podcast today. And today we are talking about EV conversions. And so we're speaking to Jason Arnold, who is the co-owner of EV Underground based out of Calgary. And he shares a little bit about their shop and the types of conversions they do. They specialize in classic cars. And he also just talks about how you can convert your ICE vehicle into an EV.
Yeah, and this is such a fun topic, and it's one that we've covered a few times. So if you listen to season 1, you would recall our conversation with the EV mad scientist. So this was just a really enthusiastic person who converts hot rods, traditional ICE vehicles, to electric vehicles. And then we did also speak to some engineering students out of the University of Calgary who were working on an EV conversion. So it is such a fun conversation to have because it's usually people who love their ICE vehicles. And, you know, Jason kind of goes into like, typically you don't see people coming in with newer cars. You see them coming in with sentimental vehicles, classic cars that they want to keep in the family and it needs work. And so they decide to convert it to an electric vehicle.
Yeah, and something cool about EV Underground is that they also offer DIY conversion kits. And so Jason goes into how you can safely convert a car all on your own, and they provide all of the instructions and materials. And yeah, it's kind of a passion project that you can work on your free time.
Yeah, definitely a passion project. So, you know, I'm curious if anyone listening has converted an ICE vehicle to an EV, let us know. And you can connect with us in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. So please let me know in the group if you have converted your ICE vehicle or even if you're considering it. Let's listen to my conversation with Jason Arnold, co-owner of EV Underground. Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thanks. Great to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and a little bit about EV Underground?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been involved with conversion community for about 15 years. A lot of people don't know that it kind of goes back that far, but there have been shops that are kind of active since the early 2010s in this industry. And so, yeah, that piqued my interest a number of years ago. I actually went off and did some schooling to kind of align with this as a career path. And when I came back to town, back to Calgary about 10 years ago, it was just kind of by coincidence that I ended up meeting with a couple of other people. One of them is David Lloyd, who I ended up co-founding with here at the shop. We were talking about conversions and realizing that at the time, conversions were still far too new to kind of be their own stand-up industry. And so we kind of came up with this idea of going with the Go Electric model. And so they're a shop here in town, not a shop, they're a dealership in town that does used EV sales. And so that was kind of the thing that got us started in terms of having that as getting EVs in Albertans' hands here. But after a year or so in business, they had a number of people that were coming in the door saying, oh, it's great that you can get me this Nissan Leaf or this Chevy Bolt, but I've got this Mustang or I've got this Volkswagen kind of thing. And so after a few of those people came in the door, we kind of realized that there was actually enough conversion interest right around 2020. And so that's kind of when we committed to bringing EV Underground in as its own business entity. And then we took on the build, and then it's just kind of been one after the other. And now we're over 4 years in it's here.
Nice. So you started building that clientele. How many conversions have you done since you started in 2020?
Since we started, it's been a bit of a slower pace. It's just been David and I here at the shop, so we're kind of a smaller outfit. We've got 3 that are kind of out the door at this point in time, and we've got another 4 in the shop currently that we're looking to get out in the next 6 to 12 months. So we're kind of accelerating the timeline there, having a slow start, but now things are starting to kind of pick up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so in the past, were you kind of working on one vehicle at a time, and now it kind of seems like you have multiple projects on the go?
Yeah, there is that, especially with this industry, there's a lot of people, there are literally throughout the States and kind of even internationally, there are kind of dozens of conversion shops. And a lot of people kind of like to do their own spin, their own secret sauce and stuff like that. And so for us too, it was just a little bit of kind of finding our feet. And we took on some interesting projects. We almost did it a little bit backwards in the sense that our first project is one that we haven't finished yet, but it's a Factory 5 kit car, which is kind of an unusual, it's Factory 5 Type 65 kit car, very very nice looking piece. But the car kind of showed up in boxes. And so doing the assembly as well as the conversion at the same time really extends the timeline and really kind of ups the ante in terms of the effort that goes into a job. So nowadays, some of the projects that we're taking on that we're looking to turn around faster, they're more conventional. We're into things like Chevelles and Land Rovers and things that are just like already a rolling chassis that we just kind of have to do the actual component swap into.
So if someone wanted to convert a car that was already sort of assembled, so it's a fully functioning ICE vehicle, what's kind of the basic steps to getting it converted to an EV?
Well, what we do here is kind of electric hot rodding. And so it's kind of that same idea where people have been doing swaps of powertrains and whatnot in a number of classic vehicles for years. And so that's kind of where we're at here is we just, keep the wheels spinning. We just put a different drivetrain in place to do that. So if somebody was to bring us a functional ICE car, we've got facilities here that we would start by basically removing all the components that we're not going to need. And so you're looking at the engine. Sometimes that involves the transmission, other things like the fueling system and the exhaust. Basically strip it down just to a rolling chassis. And then from that point, it's a matter of kind of getting a scope for what we're dealing with in terms of packaging. That's the big challenge for us is that the battery boxes by shape and volume tend to be 2 to 3 times the size of the fuel tank in the car. And so we kind of need space for the battery box because that's kind of the most immovable object. But luckily, the tech has been getting good to the point now that the battery box usually fits pretty comfortably under the hood or depending on the layout of the vehicle in another place. And then from that point, we can, work on packaging the other things in there. The motor and the gearbox is generally smaller in terms of overall volume than the ICE equivalent. And so that kind of gives us some packaging options now. The Chevelle I had mentioned a couple of minutes ago, for example, the motor and the gearbox that are tied to it are actually going to tuck into the transmission tunnel, which means that essentially we have the entire engine bay available for batteries now. So.
Right. And I'm going to ask you about timelines, which, how do you give a timeline? Because I guess it depends on the vehicle. But let's say best case scenario, how long would a conversion take?
Well, yeah, I've mentioned the word classics a few times here now, and that's kind of our wheelhouse is that we do deal with things that are kind of 1960s to like late 90s is kind of our definition there. Mm-hmm. And we're dealing with cars of that age. There's a lot of variables. If anybody's ever had a vehicle worked on that's kind of in that area, restoration can definitely be a topic. And that's been part of our challenge with our build so far is that we've had 2 projects that came in that just completely surprised us with the amount of restoration required. And so that's to say that it affects the overall timeline, not our timeline.
Right.
Everything that we've done so far has been a year plus because of the restoration component kind of throwing those curveballs. But for us right now, we're kind of quoting 6 to 9 months for the actual conversion part because there is a little bit of kind of making special cases and, there's not quite the rinse and repeat that we're getting into there. But that is something that we're looking to do as we get a little bit more experience and more builds out the door. We're kind of looking to bring that down to like 3 to 6 months kind of as we refine our process.
Why do you think you're getting a lot of requests for those classic vehicles? Is that a trend now to sort of convert these, older vehicles to EVs? I'm just kind of curious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the reason classics is kind of like that. That's kind of what we hung our shingle on is that David and I are both in that it's a classic kind of enthusiast market there. So that was the kind of vehicle that we targeted. But there's also a lot of people will come to us with requests, and there's kind of a feasibility or what we jokingly call the what do you have when you're finished equation, where there's kind of a value proposition here where if somebody comes to us with a 2006 CRV, what we're doing in terms of integration and costs and everything, it just doesn't necessarily make sense for a vehicle that doesn't have the sentimental value or the collector value or even that financial value. But there's also this notion too that like vehicles nowadays are fairly as reliable as ICE tech can be. Whereas if you're getting into something like a 60s or a 70s vehicle that might be carbureted and it might be this or that, it could be a question of parts availability. It could just be a factor that you like the aesthetic of this car, but you don't have the skill set to keep it on the road. And there's not a lot of shops out there that are necessarily equipped for it. And so it does kind of scratch a few itches. And so for us, we target classics because there's an improvement in reliability. There's kind of an improvement in terms of just the ownership experience. Sometimes there's nostalgia around the smells and the sounds of old classic cars. Sometimes for people that's off-putting. So it kind of do, yeah.
And then it looks really cool, those classic cars.
I mean, the aesthetic's not for everybody, but to us, kind of it's a challenge from a packaging point of view to kind of just take something that like battery boxes are kind of just big black cubes at the end of the day, but you can do some things to kind of dress them up and give it just a different visual appeal, right?
Right.
So, yeah. Mhm.
Are there any roadblocks that would prevent you from converting an ICE vehicle to an EV?
It's not roadblocks, but again, it is just kind of about that feasibility, right?
Hmm.
People have been doing conversions honestly for decades. You go back to the 70s where you had the oil crisis and things like that, and you did have some concept cars that were produced by Volkswagen and Chevrolet and Ford, and there are factory built EVs going back to the 70s, but there were a lot of people too that were just kind of pioneers in the sense that they would just go buy a bunch of lead acid batteries because that was the tech at the time, and they would find themselves a suitable motor made out of a forklift or something else. And because there have been kind of lower duty electric vehicles around for a while, like forklifts as an example. So people have been doing this for decades, but now it's mostly again about the feasibility there. And so people have been converting Volkswagen Beetles for decades, for example. That's probably one of the most commonly converted vehicles out there. And there's practical like space limitations is one thing. Being in Alberta, that's definitely a challenge for us because a lot of people here, they love their pickups and they love to use their as pickups. And so what I usually tell people that reach out in that vein is to kind of keep an eye on what the industry is doing. We'll have somebody reach out to us that wants to get a Chevy extended cab dually kind of conversion done, and they want to drive 500 kilometers. And I have to say to them, well, look at GM. GM can't even produce, with all of their resources, a vehicle that's quite up to that level. And I just have to remind them that it's tough because you've got the battery tech is improving all the time, but then in a bigger sense, trucks are the kind of last bastion in terms of like the use case for light duty vehicles. Pickup trucks are tough because you're hauling or you're towing and you're this and you're that, and they're not aerodynamic and all of that. And so, it's mostly for us, sport trucks is kind of where we draw the line in terms of doing trucks.
Mm. So you say you kind of draw the line at those sports trucks, but what about those classic pickup trucks? Would you do a conversion of one of those older models? Yeah. Okay.
Right. So if you've got an old C10 or you've got an old F100 or an old Dodge or something like that, they're not very heavy and they're actually not very big. And so they're not hard to electrify. It's just the intention of those isn't that you're going to use. My grandpa had a 1970s Ford that was the camper special, and he used it to pull a fifth wheel. And so we're not quite in that use case where somebody would bring us that classic with that intention.
Right.
But there are people out there that are just kind of like, I'm going to go get this classic Chevy or this classic Ford. I'm going to lower it a bit. I'm maybe going to do some nice paint, put some big wheels on it, and I want it to perform right. And so, there's a lot of other shops out there that are just kind of raising the bar in terms of performance for that. And so, EV swaps in sport trucks is kind of like the new LS swap, right? And so it's a very kind of desirable thing for performance people at the moment.
So speaking of the performance, how does the performance differ when you do that conversion?
Well, that's a big part of it is that people are kind of being won over to conversions, not necessarily by the environmental or other factors, but just the idea that there is kind of performance available and it's affordable running cost performance. Anybody can put big power into a vehicle, but then you kind of pay for it at the pump. But with electric vehicles, the motor itself has its maximum torque right from 0 RPM. And so basically instantaneous, you kind of get that pull right off the go. And so it's just a very different driving dynamic because that power is just on tap. And so there's just an entirely different kind of how the power is delivered in an electric vehicle is just very rewarding if you're performance minded. Yeah.
If you're looking for that speed.
For sure. Yeah.
So EV Underground, obviously you do conversions for people who kind of want to come in and have that done, but you also offer DIY conversion kits. So how easy is it for someone to convert their own vehicle?
Well, I mean, easy is all relative.
Depends on your skill level.
It totally does. You took the words right out of my mouth. It's skill set is basically the first question we have there. Technically speaking, there's a lot of disciplines that meet what we're doing. There's an electrical knowledge component. There's a mechanical knowledge component. There's a fabrication component too, depending on just, the definition of kit is a little bit muddy. Some people in the industry consider kit to just be a pallet of parts. We like to think of kit as something a little bit more integrated and a little more tested. So that kind of ties into your question about safety there too, is that we want to just kind of know that, you're dealing with high voltages. And obviously, when you're dealing with any kind of do-it-yourself project, hot rodding related, there are kind of risks involved there, but because you are in a high voltage category, there is a certain awareness and a certain, not really risk, but just an awareness that you need to have. And so our kits, we're kind of trying to get to the point now where you're not having to assemble that high voltage battery yourself and do all those connections. We'll provide you with the battery that's been tested, or the battery that's kind of assembled, and so there's no high voltage for you to come in contact with. It's kind of just provided as a unit. And then at that point, just kind of get to more of a plug and play model where things can just be more of a fitment exercise. And again, depending on the vehicle, some of those are just common enough now that, you can just kind of copy paste the layout from something that would fit in a Chevelle is also very likely going to fit in a pickup kind of thing. And so that's kind of where kits become a little more viable.
Right. And what's the uptick in people interested in these DIY kits? Is it more so than people wanting to come in and have you do it for them, or about the same, or what's the interest been?
Yeah, I wouldn't say quite the same. Honestly, even just telling friends and family and having conversations about what we do here, there's a lot of, I didn't know that was a thing. And
right.
So conversions are already kind of a little under most people's radar to begin with. And so because of that, I would say that the performance people are kind of catching on because at the trade level, like there are magazines now that kind of address conversions. Right next to the performance ICE magazines, you've got performance EV magazines on the shelf now. Mm-hmm. And you've trade industry shows like SEMA and stuff, which is a huge aftermarket kind of like anybody who's into performance and modifying cars. SEMA is a huge industry event. And last year when I attended, there was over 25,000 square feet of floor space that was EV conversion shops. And so there is, when you get profile at an event like SEMA, performance people are starting to catch on to this. And so we have a lot of people that are a little more DIY minded because there are a lot of people that do kind of hot rodding in their own garages. So they're starting to reach out to us. But as a general rule, a lot more customers that are reaching out to us are kind of in that mindset of like, I have this classic that's been in the family for a while. And so they're not necessarily coming for like that performance lens. They're just saying, I've got this classic vehicle that's been in the family that I want to keep on the road and I want to keep it reliably. And there's kind of a longevity component to it there too, where a lot of the components that we're selling, they don't have to worry about being able to source this in 10 or 15 years if they pass it on to their kids and stuff. So.
Yeah. So it sounds like it is a growing industry as people kind of become more aware that conversions are a thing and it's something that you can do. So I guess the questions are, how popular do you see conversions becoming and how much does the technology impact that?
Yeah, I think the popularity is definitely proportional to the ease, if you will, right? Right now, because what we're doing is so intensive kind of in labor and fabrication, there's that big custom component too. That does kind of affect, in terms of the budget and the cost and timelines, there is a lot of things that just are a little bit bigger because they're, like I said, this is a new tech. But there are companies that have been in the motorsports industry for a number of years now that are starting to catch on to this EV thing. And so as a result, they're starting to offer things that are almost, kind of in a sense off the shelf. I mean, there's still, the art is in integrating it, right? It's kind of like if you can get a sports car, but then you can take it to a shop that does the tuning for you. That's kind of where we're at, is that we're going to be doing that integration and putting everything in and all that. So the popularity there, it will start to become more accessible to people. And right now too, it's like we're here as a shop that does turnkey, and then we're exploring like part sales and kits and stuff. But there are a number of shops out there that have been doing hot rods and kind of classic car work for a number of years. And so that's kind of more the intermediate step that we see, is that partnering with shops that are doing performance for people have been coming to us and saying, like we do as a rule, a lot of performance gas cars, but then we've had people coming and saying, I heard about this electric Mustang or this electric pickup kind of thing. So to us, that's more the immediate, I think, kind of middle ground, is that we're going to be partnering with some more shops there, just kind of using their skill set and then just teaching them to kind of how to use the components and to supply those components.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing a little bit about what you do and the work that you're doing at EV Underground.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the time. And yeah, I really appreciate you actually having this space for us to have this conversation.
Anytime. It was a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jason Arnold, co-owner of EV Underground. If you'd like to get in touch with them, we'll have links in our show notes so you can check them out. And again, if you'd like to weigh in on the conversation, maybe you've converted your ICE vehicle to an EV or you're considering it, I'd love to hear from you in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you know when the next episode is out. Talk to you soon.